Is the Trinity logically coherent? In this video, I will introduce the problem and summarize 3 proposed solutions by Christian philosophers. There have been various analogies used to help elucidate how the Trinity can be 3 in one sense and 1 in another. One analogy that's been used is water. Water has 3 forms: solid, liquid, and gas. But water is one. Likewise, you could say God has 3 forms, but is one. The problem with this analogy is that it's an analogy for modalism, which is heretical. On modalism, there are not 3 distinct persons, but 3 modes or aspects of one God. For example, Superman, Clark Kent, and Kal-El are not 3 distinct persons, but 3 aspects of one person. The water analogy would be more apt for Superman than the Trinity. Another analogy that's used is the egg. The egg has a shell, white, and yolk, but it is still one egg. The problem with this analogy is that the shell is not an egg, but a part of the egg. So, this analogy would imply that Jesus is a part of God, but not fully God. Let's look at the 3 claims that seem to lead to a contradiction. Orthodox Christianity maintains that 1. The Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. 2. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are distinct. 3. There is only one God. The coherence of the 3 claims depends on what is meant by the is. Suppose we are using the is of identity. In that case, when we say Jesus is God, we're saying that Jesus is identical to God. Saying A is identical to B means they are numerically one and the same thing. According to the transitivity of identity, if A is identical to B, and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C.
If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. It's logically necessitated.
This entails that if Jesus is identical to God, and the Father is identical to God, then Jesus is identical to the Father, which leads to a contradiction. So, Trinitarians must deny that they are using the is of identity. Most of the time, when we use is, we're using the is of predication. The is of predication is used to attribute a property to something. For example, when we say Fido is a dog, we're attributing the property of being a dog to Fido. If, in using the is of predication, I say Fido is a dog, and Rover is a dog, we end up with 2 dogs. That means that using the is of predication, in Jesus is God, would lead to 3 gods. To sum up, the is of identity leads to a contradiction, and the is of predication leads to polytheism. I will go over 3 ways that philosophers have tried to avoid logical contradictions in the Trinity. The first view, Trinity monotheism, is held by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. Craig's favorite analogy is of the mythical 3-headed dog Cerberus. Cerberus is one dog with 3 consciousnesses. Similarly, God is one being with 3 consciousnesses. On this view, it's the whole of the Trinity that's identical to God. Only the Trinity is God, and the persons of the Trinity are parts of God. Think of the egg analogy. Jesus is God is really shorthand for Jesus is a part of God. They still argue that God is one being, because there is only one soul, endowed with 3 sets of rational faculties. I think most Christians will find the idea that Jesus is only part of God heretical. The next view is relative identity, which was first endorsed by Peter Geach, and, more recently, Peter Van Immergen. On Geach's view, A is identical to B is elliptical for A, is the same X as B. Identity is relative to some object X, rather than being absolute. Here's an example to help clarify. Consider 2 copies of Ulysses, A and B. Instead of asking if A is the same as B, we have to ask if A is the same as B, relative to some X. Relative to literary works, they are the same and we count 1 literary work. But relative to books they are different, and we count 2 books. Similarly, relative identity theorists say that with respect to the Father, Jesus and the Holy Spirit, relative to God we count 1, but relative to persons we count 3. Relative identity theorists say that when we ask if A is identical to B, we have to ask relative to what. Trenton Merrickx gives an objection to relative identity, quote, "The claim that the Father is the same God as the Son seems to entail that the Father is identical with the Son. This entailment seems to hold because, in general, A's being the same F as B, seems to entail that A is identical with B. More carefully, this entailment seems to hold for relations like being the same dog as, or being the same tree as, or being the same human as, or being the same God as. But it does not seem to hold for relations like being the same shape as, or being the same size as, or being the same height as. We are happy to accept, for example, that A is the same height as B, while denying that A is identical with B. Indeed, A's being the same height as B not only fails to imply that A is identical with B, it also fails to imply that A is a height, and that B is a height. A's being the same dog as B, however, seems to imply not only that A is identical with B, but also that A is a dog, and that B is a dog. Defenders of relative identity typically insist that, for example, A's being the same tree as B, does not imply that A is identical with B. They think that all identities are relative, and so fail to entail being the same as. In other words, they typically deny there is any such thing as absolute identity. Insofar as relative identity implies that there is no absolute identity, then, it is false, for surely there is absolute identity. Surely there is something that is identical with itself, end quote. What Merrickx is getting at here is that when we use the same as relation, there is a difference between applying it to objects like dogs, trees, and God and when we apply it to properties like height or color. It makes sense to say that A has the same color as B while not being absolutely identical, but it doesn't make sense to say that A is the same dog as B without A being absolutely identical to B. When we apply it to objects, identity is absolute and not relative. J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig also object to relative identity, quote, Van Inwagen himself admits that apart from Trinitarian theology, there are no known cases of allegedly relative identities that cannot be analyzed in terms of classical identity. Van Inwagen confesses that he has no answer to the questions of how X and Y can be the same being, without being the same person. It seems, then, that the ability to state coherently the Trinitarian claims under discussion using the device of relative identity is a hollow victory. End quote. The final view that I'll go over is defended by Jeffrey Brower and Michael Ray. The view has been called Constitution Trinitarianism. Their basic idea is that we can use Aristotle's view on material constitution as an analogy for the Trinity. Consider a statue that is being used as a pillar in a building. They argue that the statue is distinct from the pillar, because we can have one without the other. They have distinct properties. Surface erosion could destroy the statue and not the pillar, and we can remove the statue from the building so that it is no longer a pillar. Since we can have one without the other, they must be distinct. Yet the statue and pillar occupy the same space, so they must count as one material object. For Aristotle, every material object is a hylomorphic compound, a compound of matter and form. You can think of form as an organizational property that's not limited to shape. Think of it as a thing's nature. The statue and pillar are constituted by the same matter, but they have different forms, so they are distinct hylomorphic compounds. Yet they still count as one material object. Brower and Ray use this as an analogy for the Trinity. What plays the role of matter will be the divine nature, and the forms will be the properties of being the Father, being the Son, and being the Spirit. So we have three distinct hylomorphic compounds in the three persons, but one spiritual object in God. There are various ways to object to this. William Lane Craig objects that God is not composed of stuff, not even spiritual stuff. Dale Tuggy objects that if the three persons are hylomorphic compounds, then it would force the three persons to have the same mental states. Quote, suppose that a lump of matter constitutes both a statue and a pillar. Let us grant that both statue and pillar are real, and are distinct. So long as the lump of matter constitutes both the pillar and the statue, there's a certain range of properties with respect to which the three cannot differ, including shape, color, smell, mass, location, size, and temperature. If there is such a thing in the world as a constitution relation, it requires, so long as it obtains, the constitutor and any constituted thing or things, to be indiscernible with respect to a wide range of properties. Which properties are accepted from this range? That is, in what ways might the three differ? Plausible candidates include properties of origin, time of annihilation, and essence. These are all properties which are either essential or relational, or both. One can't think of any sort of property which is both non-essential and intrinsic, which could be had by constitutor, but not constitutee, or vice versa. Thus it seems that constituting and constituted objects can only differ in properties which are essential or relational, or both. Consider now the Father and the Son, which on this theory are constituted, by not a lump of matter, but rather by a nature. If indeed this nature plays the role of matter here, then we'd expect it, so long as it is shared, to force the sameness of all non-essential and intrinsic properties. Yet, there have been times at which Father and Son have differed intrinsically. End quote. What Tuggy is saying here is that if the persons of the Trinity are hylomorphic compounds, then the stuff that makes them up forces them to share the same intrinsic properties, just like the lump of matter that makes up the statue and pillar forces them to be the same temperature. Since mental states are intrinsic, this would force the Father and Jesus to have the same mental states, but this seems heretical. Another worry is that what counts as statues and pillars seems relative to a person's goal. A person could use the statue as a goal post, and now it has the hylomorphic form of a goal post. So it seems that we can create an infinity of hylomorphic compounds by having different goals. By contrast, we don't want to say that the identity of a person depends on another person's goal. Let's summarize. What is meant by Jesus is God? If we use the is of identity, and say Jesus is identical to God, then it leads to a logical contradiction. If we use the is of predication, and say Jesus is a God, then it leads to polytheism. On Trinity monotheism, Jesus is part of God, not fully God, and this seems heretical. On relative identity, we say Jesus is the same as the Father with respect to God, but not with respect to persons. This is a highly controversial theory of identity. On constitution Trinitarianism, we say Jesus is a hylomorphic compound of one God. This leads to the three persons of the Trinity having the same mental states. And Aristotle's view on material constitution is itself controversial. In my opinion, these are the three most promising views. I left out a lot of other models of the Trinity that I think people will find less plausible. For example, on Richard Swinburne's functional monotheism, Jesus is created by the Father. A final option that some take is to treat the Trinity as a logical mystery.
So God's mind is actually the laws of logic.